how you manage people's expectations can really determine success or failure. We want alignment, but we also have to be realistic that we're not going to get 100% of people on board 100% of the time. And so this idea that there will be times that we have to disagree, but commit is important, because what matters is what are we trying to accomplish? And does that accomplishment represent a step forward for the organization, even if it's not the way that you see it?
Ruling fertility practices with an iron fist. That's what I'd do, but I can't get doctors to come work for me for reasons that are probably unrelated. So I talked to two people for whom fertility doctors and embryologists do actually work. And we talk about when and how to build consensus and when and how to say, this is the direction the bus is driving in. I think it's the first time I've had the CEO and the CSO of Fertility Network on at the same time. I've wanted to do it for a little while. And because of Ms. Cara Reymann and Dr. Alison Bartolucci from First Fertility, I think we'll do plenty more of it. They share the emotional cost of being a leader, the network-wide decision to implement digital witnessing in all 9 of First Fertility's IVF labs, the relationship between the clinical, business, and lab executives, including Alison's and Cara's, a magic question, I'm the one calling it that, by the way, that Cara asks to get stakeholders on the same page about an issue, Cara's decision to abandon a mandate to implement one EMR across First Fertility, why Alison thinks the customer service of a lab monitoring service called Ziltrix is so phenomenal, and the business benefit of that beyond happy embryologists, and Alison's approach to building rapport with her embryologists and lab directors when they were at first reluctant to open up to her. Each Dr. Bartolucci and Ms. Raymond deserve their own interview. Don't worry, I will. In the meantime, enjoy this one. If you like the information in this episode, we're compiling so much more data on new technology in IVF, products, services, market analyses, info on mergers and acquisitions, and data on every company in the fertility space. Go to data.insidereproductivehealth.com. If your company isn't an IVF Heroes Universe sponsor, your competitors are so much more visible to your customers because we report on your category and we give that info to your customers. Go to data.insidereproductivehealth.com to learn more about other fertility companies or submit your company today. Don't be left out.
Today's advertiser helped make the production and delivery of this episode possible for free to you. But the themes expressed by the guests do not necessarily reflect the views of Inside Reproductive Health, nor of the advertiser. The advertiser does not have editorial control over the content of this episode, and the guest's appearance is not an endorsement of the advertiser.
I think Cara and I, share the same vision. And that's why when at least when I met her, I was so excited to have the opportunity, or the potential at that time, opportunity to really have a seat at the table as a lab representative, as a lab director. And our interactions are sometimes very formal and have a clear mission. Other times it's more casual, but I would say all of the above. We talk on the phone, we text, we meet once a week, we meet with other executive leaders, other lab leaders. She's very much in the trenches as I.
So a good interviewer would have looked up who the chief medical officer of First Fertility was first before asking this question, but let's pretend a good interviewer was asking this question. Are you doing it with is it always CSO, CMO, CEO at the same time, or sometimes you're having one-to-one meetings? How does everybody come together?
We don't have a chief medical officer. So what we do have is a medical advisory board, and we meet with that medical advisory board on a monthly basis. And so other executives in the organization participate in that meeting, and it's really the opportunity to shape the direction of the organization clinically. We really let the lab and our scientific, partners, as well as the physicians, shape the agenda for that meeting. And then our administrative team is there to add context support, take away, thoughts, ideas, make sure we can execute on some of the things that they talk about. But It's been a journey over the last 2 years to really build that part of the organization. I came to First Fertility in 2023. We did not have active teams in these areas at that time. So it was, one of the first things that we tried to organize around was, what does our medical leadership, clinical leadership look like? What does our scientific leadership look like?
There wasn't a medical advisory board at the time you joined, Kara?
There was not. There was an idea of one. There was not a formal cadence of meetings. There wasn't a lot of engagement around that. So I think the foundation was there. And then it was just how do we actually make it meaningful? And really, what do we want that group to add? What value do we want to learn from that group? What value do we think we can bring to that group? I'm very pleased to have a very engaged group, both with the medical advisory board and the lab, and really pleased to see that they come to the table with ideas that, their own. We do a journal club. I think, what is it, Allison? Once a quarter, the medical advisory board meeting, actually, rather than just being a board meeting, it's a journal club. That was the idea of one of our board members that leads some research in one of our centers. So I think all around, it's created a culture of engagement that has created a lot of camaraderie and great value, just professionally, but also for the organization.
How did you decide? How did you all decide on that structure of having a medical advisory board as opposed to and or a chief medical officer?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's an evolution. I think for sure, as we grow, a chief medical officer is something that has been on my radar, and I have a desire to pursue that. But I think we were still trying to learn who we were as an organization when I joined, and this has given us some room and some space to get to know each other, to understand what everybody's priorities are, to really build our own priorities as an organization. And also, we grew really quickly. We almost doubled in size just in a single year. So there was a lot to work through, adding as many new team members into the mix during that period. So one step at a time. And I think we still have a lot ahead of us and are still looking forward to this landscape evolving and our leadership evolving.
So it's part of the evolution. Allison, do you have a scientific advisory board, or are you ruling the labs with an iron fist?
No, that's not my style. And again, like that was something that Cara had envisioned and really formalized as well as creating this laboratory advisory board where the lab gets to come together, the lab directors and even the lab managers as well come together once a month and they are deciding what's important. They're deciding the policies that they want to have implemented across the network. They're deciding what vendors they're going to align with, things that are important to everybody. And they're making the decisions and they're making the plans on how to execute on them. What was really exciting for me was that, I feared that as we came in as First Fertility, there would be resistance from the lab. I was initially, a little bit nervous about how they would embrace being part of First Fertility, being part of the advisory board. Um, I have to admit, it was a little bit quiet in the beginning, like a lot of me talking and crickets. But over time, we really formed these relationships. And what was like so telling to me was that everyone actually was really looking for this opportunity to have a bigger community. By design, the lab is, if you think about the physical IVF lab, if you've ever seen one, I mean, they tend to be
Not
completely
much bigger than a prison cell. I'm pretty sure
exactly.
Scandinavian countries have bigger prison cells than
Yes,
most IVF.
there's no windows. It's on purpose isolated from the rest of the clinic. And what happens is that like physical isolation becomes, kind of drifts into the cultural isolation. So to bring everyone together and sharing these, tales of woe, but also shared experiences, it's become this broader community that, ask each, they ping each other when they have questions or it's been really great to watch it unfold.
Yeah, and I've watched this evolution. I warned Allison that These first meetings, it's always going to be very quiet. I think people are wanting to know what to expect. They're afraid to engage. And I told her, just keep moving forward, keep, developing a agenda or a forum where people can speak up. And then the more they do it, the more they'll speak up. And so I don't attend all of the lab board meetings, but I like to drop in periodically. I do that to everybody. I don't know if they love it or hate it, but I learn a lot from those interactions. And it is remarkable. It's remarkable to see how enthusiastic that team is. It's remarkable to see how much candid conversation they have with one another. And Allison and I, some of our conversations, have been, hey, I had this meeting with the lab board. It did or didn't go as expected. What were your thoughts about what you saw? So I think a lot of leadership is just being reflective and unpacking, okay, I took this approach. Did it work? Did it not work? What might have worked better? And that's where I try to spend a lot of my time, because I think how we engage with each other matters. And then, it becomes, it creates that momentum for more engagement.
Allison, when you were having a bit of one-way conversations in the beginning, do you think that was because people were thinking, well, she's just going to make us do it her way, they weren't necessarily seeing it as a First Fertility team yet, that here's Allison, she's from CARS, she's from Yukon system, and so like that's her way of doing things as opposed to our way of doing things. Is that why you think there was a bit of trepidation in the beginning?
Definitely. Definitely in that, almost all of us are total introverts and shy by nature. So that those two things combined, absolutely. But I think, and that's how I felt. That's how everybody feels. And it's completely normal. But, I think that once the realization occurred that just like Cara had brought me in to have a seat at the table for First Fertility, I was bringing these people in to also have a seat and to really voice their concerns, their perspectives, and really make a difference in First Fertility, but that translates to the field as a whole.
Looking back, do you think of any things that you might have been able to do to speed up that process? Or is that just the nature of rapport building? It takes time. It takes you just showing up, doing it, them seeing that they can trust you. Are there any things that you look back at and you think, maybe if I had introduced this practice, I could have started to get the ball rolling a little bit more quickly? Or is time just necessary?
No, we're in completely different locations. I think, when you were first asking me that, the first thing that came to mind is like, well, yeah, if I was with them every day and working side by side, like I used to be as a lab director, but that's impossible. Cara really was the one who encouraged me to meet with them individually, one-on-one. So that process evolved. I think if I had been more maybe proactive about meeting with them one-on-one, maybe we would have expedited that process. But overall, I think the way it unfolded was very organic and contributed to the success.
Cara, what have the consequences been of the prisoners getting together?
I know, you always wonder.
Have the riots started yet?
Yeah, exactly. Right. Will the inmates run the asylum? I think the way that we manage expectations is, you have to be realistic. You're working with groups of people and not just the lab group. You know, everybody wants the outcome that they want, right? But that outcome has to be delivered in the context of a very dynamic environment. So, the lab team might want one outcome. The physician and clinical teams might want a different outcome. The network of First Fertility might want yet a third outcome. So, how you manage people's expectations as you kind of move through those exercises, can really determine success or failure. I think we try to message at every step of the way that, we are seeking input, we want alignment, but we also have to be realistic that we're not going to get 100% of people on board 100% of the time. And so, this idea that there will be times that we have to disagree, but commit is important, because what matters is not your opinion or my opinion. What matters is, what are we trying to accomplish? And does that accomplishment represent, a step forward for the organization, even if it's not the step forward the way that you see it? It helps people at least be able to feel like, okay, I got to have a say. And more importantly, can you understand where somebody else is coming from? I have this conversation a lot. I've had to have a lot of difficult conversations, and I try to tell people, my commitment is you may not always agree with me, but I want you to understand. And I think when you give people those opportunities, everybody in the end, is generally a reasonable person. And if you can just establish that respectful culture where feedback is not only sought but appreciated, then I find it easier to kind of get through those difficult conversations where there's kind of multiple different goals and personalities and, desires at the table.
That's what makes it hard being in that top seat, is that you've got multiple constituents and those needs are sometimes at odds. Your job is to find out where they aren't at odds and to bring them together. But that does require some people to focus on some of their needs more than others, or getting them to see the value in the bigger picture. Can you think of a specific example? And you might be limited into how much detail that you can go into, but to the extent that you can, what's a specific example you can think of where you had to have one of those harder conversations?
Can think of many. But we've done a couple things over this last year. We implemented the electronic witnessing system, which Allison can talk more about. But we went through a thoughtful process of how we evaluated the different products that were on the market, what we felt was going to serve our goals and needs. And the word that people like to use, and I never let them get away with this, by the way, and I think it's part of a healthy culture, is, people like to show up and use, sometimes some language that's not always productive, like, just tell me if this is a mandate. Is this a mandate? Because if it's a mandate, then, we'll just do whatever you tell us to do. And, I just don't let people get away with painting it, with that broad of a brushstroke. We all agreed that pursuing an electronic witnessing system was material, to the quality of the services and the risk management of the organization. And that's what it's about. It's not about whether or not it's a mandate. It's about whether or not this is technology that makes us safer, and creates more value. And if that's, the goal, then it just comes down to, is it going to be product A or product B? And what does it mean in practical reality when we have to actually implement and use those products? I try to do my part in keeping, you know, people's perspectives, coming from the right direction, because you definitely, I think, get some of that, language and verbiage. But Allison can talk about the process, because we also learned a few lessons in how we went through the exercise, and we were communicating in one channel and maybe needed to communicate a little more broadly and in a little more detail to other channels so that they could also be brought along and understand. So, Allison, maybe you can share some of your lessons learned there.
So, I mean, that's actually, it's a good example because I was really patting myself on the back about bringing the lab board in and letting them kind of vet the vendors and the products and then make a decision as a group, which they did. And it was really a wonderful process. And the whole point was that, to Kara's point, I mean, it's not about being a mandate. If it was, that's going to defeat the purpose of implementing these systems, because if they're not embraced and used as part of the daily operation of the lab, then there's no point. Then you're wasting your money. So, it was this great process, but I kept it very much, contained within the lab people, the lab directors, the lab managers, the embryologists, the andrology technicians. But, I was really proud of how much I was communicating. But the one piece I didn't think about was like all the administrative people and the center leaders, totally in the dark. And when we kind of just made the announcement, yeah, it floored me. I was like, well, what do they care? But yeah, it does affect them substantially. It's their budgets. They actually have to use the systems as well. And also just having transparency and visibility into what we're doing is key. And again, that
Let's
helps.
spend a little bit more time on that. It might sound like the minutia of one particular example, but I think it illustrates the principle that a lot of people are going through. What are some of because I probably would have shared your default point of view, which is what do they care? We're doing witnessing in the lab. What does it matter to these admin folks? What were the downstream implications that mattered to them?
I think at the very core, it was just that they were kept in the dark. And I think that is important for me as a leader to understand that people, fear what they don't know. And I think we all do this. You can kind of construe all these imaginary conspiracy theories in your head as to what people are cooking up. And so just the mere fact that I was not sharing this with them was, I think, the most, you know, egregious. But really it was, I think from a real practical standpoint, just knowing like how understanding what it was, what they were going to need to prepare for from a logistical standpoint, how they could then support their lab in terms of purchasing consumables and budgeting and expectations. And
Yeah, there were some downstream things that, were fair when you think about, okay, who needed to know? There was a budget implication because obviously you're purchasing a system, but you can't bill for that system, and so you're absorbing the cost of that system. There was some installation that had to happen in terms of, hardware, software, devices. I don't know all the details, but there certainly was an element of that. So then it's like, okay, how do you schedule around that, especially in a busy laboratory where, you're trying to do your day-to-day work? I do think there's some point of entry that maybe happens across different team members. So now it becomes a workflow consideration. And then it's timing, who's going first. And you learn something every time you do an implementation. So it's always like, okay, you got to get one under your belt. What do you learn from that? Then you move on to the next ones. They were really fair considerations across all of those things. And to Allison's point, you can think that you're doing everything right. And listen, we could have a whole podcast about how it would be so much easier to just run things with an iron fist and say, we're doing this. This is what it's going to look like. Move along. I mean, we could move so fast. But what you do when you approach things that way is you lose the goodwill. I think eventually maybe you can get it back because if these things then prove themselves out and everybody ultimately comes around and says, oh, yeah, this is better. That's great. But like, man, the friction, the goodwill that you have to try to push through is really difficult, can be very damaging. So we choose to do the hard work up front, which is to be engaged, to welcome opinions and, but we're not going to be perfect. In this instance, we had to take a step back and, to Allison's point, she was really proud of the process that she ran and she did get some harsh feedback when she shared that we were going to be doing this, expecting it was going to be so, well received. And she called me and was like, man, I'm a little caught off guard. And I said, well, and, I'm here to give her the perspective of like, okay, well, if you think about it from this perspective, kind of, then you can understand where that might be coming from. And she said, okay, you're right. I didn't think about it that way. And it's like, the great thing is, you can just go back and fix that. It's not like you've lost that opportunity forever, right? Like you just pause and say, hey, I listened to your feedback. You're right. I should have been, shared more information sooner. Let's do it now, and then we'll get there. And that's what we did in that circumstance. And I think how many more do we have to do, Allison? We're
just two.
almost done?
Yeah, 2 more left.
Out of how many labs?
9.
So I want to ask about when you decide to do something across all 9 labs versus when you decide to do some things at some labs, because I imagine there are things where it's more important to do it across all 9 and others where you can do it this way or that way. I know that at some of the labs that you do use, I think you use Ziltrix. I've had people like Dr. Jindalon seem to really like it, and people like Dr. Shankman seem to really like it. What do you use Ziltrix for?
So we use Ziltrix in a couple of our labs. It's the main alarm system for one of them, and will be for one of the ones that's sort of under construction right now. I remember Dr. Jindal talking about the customer service, and I second that comment. It is second to none. Actually, the lab that we have it installed in currently needed something kind of urgently. And they were, I mean, on a plane, getting it hooked up, troubleshooting. In fact, this is a great story that I kind of forgot actually. They put a temperature probe in one of the refrigerators that was in there. And they called me and they were like, I think this refrigerator is dying. And I was like, that's a coincidence. And like you just put something in there, blah, blah, blah. But we looked at the data and it's true. Like the temperature was like all over the place. And I mean, literally, as soon as they installed that, they were saving our butts. So they are exemplary. I do like one of their features that I think puts them apart is they have, the alarms will call the lab people and there's a phone tree, kind of like what you would expect. But if none of the lab people respond, it goes to them and they're there 24 hours. And I think that's a really nice, you know, measure of security there that others don't offer.
I want to come back to that principle of customer service, but I want to not lose the other question I wanted to ask about. When do you decide to do something at the network level? So, for example, for witnessing, you could have said just some of our labs should have witnessing. Sounds like you all came to a consensus and decided that it's material to the quality of the work to have all 9 labs have electronic witnessing. How do you decide when something should be done at all 9 versus this lab can decide for themselves?
Well, with the witnessing, it was a unique opportunity to really align on something because none of them had anything in place currently. Understanding and identifying that this was an important technology that I think everyone can agree is crucial. And then saying, so none of us have it, and we have an opportunity to all have the same thing. So that was how we approached it there. Now, when we look at other systems, like alarm systems, for example, they all have alarm systems. So it's a little bit different. So it's like, as you're looking for new systems, here's what we've, recommended from the network standpoint. Here are the people we have good experiences with, but we're not going to sort of fix something that's not broken.
So one part of the criteria is there a blank enough slate?
Yeah. Right.
But is there also a criteria of need? Like, so for example, let's say they were all some were using this kind of time lapse, or that some were using this kind of alarm, or some were using this kind of oil and media, or some were. At what point is it, or maybe there isn't one, is to say, okay, not just is there a blank slate, but one in any one of these categories is clearly so much better of a product, or maybe so much better of a practice than the others that we've got to standardize this across the board.
Yeah, and I'm not sure. There's so many great products out there that I don't know if there's anything that's not really subjective, in terms of this one is better than the other. But what we do, again, the lab board together with me, is we establish criteria. Like you can use whatever media you want, but this is how, this is what this is what we've established for benchmarks for blastocyst development, for fertilization. So as long as you are operating within these guidelines, that is sufficient. So I think the approach that we've taken is to say, you have the autonomy to some extent, but we all have to be meeting these standards together.
Cara, that doesn't drive you crazy as a business person to have different labs and different clinics ordering things, doing different things? And if I can say so, I think First Fertility has a reputation of being on the spectrum that allows for more clinic autonomy. And I think that might mean for more lab autonomy as well. So if there's a spectrum, maybe on one end of the spectrum, I had Dr. Kishit's Murdia on from Indira IVF in India. He's like, I hired 250 docs who are all younger than me, and I tell them exactly what protocols to do. And it's more democratic in coming up with the protocols, but those are the protocols. You don't do other protocols. And as a business person, I'm like, yeah, I like that. But you all kind of have a reputation of being on the other end of the spectrum where you let this clinic decide and that lab decide. And I don't know that situation too intimately, so maybe I'm making that up. But Alison seems to be providing some evidence for that. It doesn't drive you crazy as a business person. Just say, let's come up with these things so we're all buying the same thing and following the same processes, so it's easier to have a scalable business.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that it doesn't drive me crazy. I would say that I'm a very practical person at heart, and I also am very committed to, a long-term goal and vision, and I know precisely how to make progress along that timeline. And sometimes, the best way to make progress is actually to move a little slower so that you can build the trust, get people's, build consensus, get people's buy in. What you're seeing with First Fertility is that we are moving closer and closer to looking alike, but it's by choice. It's by choice because we've done things one at a time. People have seen the value of those things. And now, when we want to do the next thing, their experience is such that, oh, well, the last time we did this, it had a good outcome. Maybe it wasn't a perfect outcome, but they're more trusting in that next decision to do the next thing. And so, what I expect to see with First Fertility is that we will accelerate, on that journey. But I also believe, you don't have to have everything look exactly alike. I remain, probably one of the only clinics that doesn't have, and I mean, big networks that doesn't have a single EMR. When I came to First Fertility, there had been a mandate, as I was informed, that everybody would move into the same EMR. That EMR had been selected, and there was a complete uproar across the organization about that decision. And, the first thing I did in my role was to just say, hey, I'm going to pump the brakes here. I need to learn a little bit more about this decision before I'm ready to commit. I do come from a background. I worked for a company for 12 years. I went through the process of that company moving on to a single EMR, but it was a different circumstance. That company came together under a single tax ID. That's typically not the case in networks. You don't have single tax IDs. And, fertility is not a space that has matured in its technological advancements and applications. And so it's somewhat risky, I think, to move too quickly in forcing some of these changes at a network level because the field, the technology hasn't matured to that point. For me at that time, I was less, I had less of a desire to force physicians to make clinical workflow changes than I did to just have access to the data that I needed the way that I needed it. And so the way that we kind of compromised early on in First Fertility was to say, like Allison said, look, we have to meet certain criteria. Some of that is our criteria, and some of it like is imposed upon us, just regulatory criteria. And I said, look, clinical decisions are your decisions. I respect the tools that you want to use for your clinical practice. But the administrative decisions are my decisions, are our decisions in First Fertility and, the administrative team. And we need the tools that we need to do that work for you. And so we'll select those tools, right? So I'm not going to select your tools, but you're also not going to select my tools. And kind of once we looked at it that way, everybody thought, that sounds okay. So we've moved into a single billing system. Same thing. We'll do our last installation in the next month or so here on that billing system. I knew that the network was going to naturally move probably towards a single EMR. We're down to, like, for all intents and purposes, 2 EMRs in our network. I don't doubt that, our journey eventually gets us there. But again, it will get us there, I think, in a more organic way. And I think that'll be healthier.
Let's talk about that overlap for a little bit, because I ask every CEO that comes on, when every CEO says, we don't make clinical decisions for our doctors, we don't tell them what to do, and everybody except for Dr. Murdia has pretty much said that. And I don't think that they're like being disingenuous. I think that that's the way they view it. I just don't think that they fully really appreciate the overlap between administrative operations and clinical operations, and that if I'm saying, okay, here's the pharmacy that we're using, guys, you might think that's an administrative decision, but not entirely. That does impact what works with nurses. Or if I say, here's the patient software that we're going to use, the patient education software that we're going to use, that impacts how well patients are informed and they go through treatment. And they might sound like administrative decisions. And again, I am a person that I like standardization. So I don't think it's standardization is always good or always bad. These are trade-offs. But I do think that you're pointing to something, the EMR being a good example, where there is that overlap between admin and clinical. And at the end of the day, somebody's got to win. And in this case, you were willing to say, all right, we're just going to do the billing part and you make the decisions on the clinical side. But isn't there a tension there?
Always. The way that I handle that is, you gather the information holistically, what happens on the admin side, what happens on the clinical side. And then you look at it and you actually just ask the question, tell me how we can afford not to do it. And that's a hard question to answer when you put the right information together. So that makes, the conversation a little bit easier. And when physicians finally get the opportunity, to have dialogue around, you know, what it takes to be, successful in the environment and support and provide everything that they want, they begin to understand that, everything is a series of choices. And I'm perfectly willing to support their choices, but they have to tell me, how we can do that under certain restrictions or limitations, because I'm always willing to compromise. But oftentimes, what you have to compromise, you're not willing to. So you have to go back and re-examine your decision and say, okay, I understand now there's many more moving parts to this than I realized, and it requires me to be more thoughtful or critical in how I'm looking at something. And then we come back to the table, we have another discussion. And, I have yet to be confronted with a circumstance, and I've been confronted with some very, very difficult ones that I haven't been able to navigate successfully. That doesn't mean that everybody's walked away happy, but I think it does mean, we've all been able to walk away and say, that, okay, I'm satisfied. I can live with this because at least I understand it.
Some people might not have an answer to the question, tell me how we can afford not to do it because it's not their domain. But does that question sometimes help people to see that there are implications that are much more broad for the organization than just their domain?
100%.
Have you all, and Allison, maybe you've come to this or maybe you haven't yet, but you've talked a little bit about there's benefits to ruling with an iron fist, but there's benefits to consensus. And you've talked about the benefits of coming to consensus and hearing people out. But there are also downsides to that. And I think ultimately good leadership is about building the skills that allow you to hit the perfect spot on the XY axis. And it's very, very hard to be perfect with that stuff. But I've definitely erred on the too much consensus in the past, and realizing that I was involving people that it wasn't really their domain, and they didn't really have consequences if the decision didn't pan out, yet they felt like they should have the say over certain things. And that was a consequence of poor management on my part. But I did see that there is a way to build the consensus, and then there's a time for saying, now we've made the decision and this is what we're doing, and there has to be a spokesperson for that, and that's the leader's job. So have you come to the point where you've gotten bitten from too much consensus or too slow to execution?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, somebody said to me once, it's about giving everyone a voice. That doesn't mean that that doesn't mean they have a decision, like they get to make the decision necessarily, but having a voice so that their opinion is heard is what is important. And, yeah, I have certainly fallen victim to trying to get everybody's consensus, trying to sort of like make everybody happy. And we all know what happens. I mean, nothing gets done and everyone is unhappy. So, I think, yeah, it's a learning experience. It was important to me to form relationships with all the lab directors, but of course, at some point I need to say, and have had to say, no, this is not a non-negotiable. This needs, like, for example, I mean, I'm not saying they were doing this, but some of the things that I have said are not negotiables. There has to be, before we had electronic witnessing, double witnessing. You have to be identifying patients and samples with at least two unique identifiers. The men have to be present when they bring their samples into the clinic. So there have been, and I did get some pushback on, some of those things that, down the line, but those were things that in my experience will burn you, that those are the non-negotiables, and these things come up all the time.
This has been an interesting evolution for Allison, and actually, I've loved watching it. I think she and I had some conversations early on about, you know, the tendency to be too nice, to want to build too much consensus. And by the way, this is a female thing, right? Like, it's completely a female thing. The desire to want, to make everybody happy and to please people, and you're wired to do this. And it really, I think, erodes our ability to be strong leaders sometimes, or to be seen as strong leaders sometimes, because you're too busy, trying to please people. And you need to learn in those moments to be very clear and very confident in, what you are willing and what you are not willing to either tolerate or accept based on what it means for the team or for the organization. And those are really hard moments. So I've been super proud of how Allison has really embraced, her leadership skill and developed that, because she certainly, I think, stepped into this a little more timid. This is her first chief scientific officer role. So it's always hard to step into that first role and show up in a way where you can walk into a room and have the command of the room. And she's worked very hard on it, and she's earned it with her team, and she's coming from the right perspective and direction. And sometimes you just need somebody behind you saying, why are you questioning yourself on this? Like, of course, this is the right decision and the right direction. And you just need to be clear about saying, like, hey, I appreciate your point of view here. The rationale is, the safety and the risk and all of those things. And we can't compromise on those things. And therefore, this is the process. There does come that time when you have to draw that line.
I think that you're hitting on the balance of mature leadership, which is the balance of agreeability and disagreeability. And it's not being infinitely one or the other. I think after Sheryl Sandberg wrote her book, it was like, let's just be disagreeable. It's like, you didn't like that from the old guard. Why would you like it from a new generation of leaders? It's more about, no, there are times where you have to be disagreeable. And in those times, you do it. And that's part of being a good leader. And in those moments, like the examples you were illustrating, Cara, what I like to do is meet with the stakeholders that I know aren't bought in, that prior to any group meetings individually, steelman their argument to them, say, okay, I understand this is important to you because of A, B, and C. And A, B, and C are important. We are going to go in this direction instead because of D, E, and F. And here's why I've got to prioritize D, E, and F over A, B, and C at this time. It helps a lot. I run a very small company. I imagine that would be really, really hard to do in a bigger organization. What's the limit to how much you can do that in an organization your size?
I would tell you, maybe the unexpected answer is, I don't know there's a limit in terms of, number of issues that you can do that with, but I will tell you there's an emotional limit. It takes a lot to invest in, just building the consensus across an organization, because you are personally, like you said, Griffin, you are personally showing up. You are personally, there to listen and learn, and you are giving that, the airtime it needs, and you're letting that inform your decision. And so then, knowing you've put that much time, effort, emotion, care into something, and know that you can never please everybody, and there will always be people who, no matter what, are just going to throw all the darts at you, can be super difficult, because how much you put into caring about, making the right decision and giving people the right platform, but also knowing, like, you're going to end up at a decision. It can be hard. And so the more that you're navigating that, if you're doing 3, 4, 5 different things, yeah, it's super hard, I think, to absorb, that type of feedback, because we're all human at the end of the day, and we all have good intentions. We hope that we can align and, end up at good conclusions. But yeah, emotionally, I would tell you, is the limitation. Like, how much can you absorb as a single person in terms of, just heat, and sometimes it's very personal, by the way, right? Somebody's not happy, and they can be very personal with that. Yeah, it's as long as I've been doing it, you know, I don't always have as tough of an exterior as I need, to make it through, kind of multiple different disruptive phases at the same time.
When do you decide that, okay, we're beyond the point of having healthy debate and a consensus? Now this person's a saboteur. They're not letting this go forward, and therefore we have to part ways with that person, because I've been there before too. I want my team to bring issues to me. I want them to fight for what's important, and I want to hear them out. And I do that steel manning. And if they're still fighting, I'd see like, okay, did I miss anything? But I don't mean to do this to say that I'm doing this infinitely. We get to a point where it's like, okay, I've steel manned your argument back to you. You're not pointing out anything else that I've missed. This is the decision that we're going forward in. And if someone were to keep fighting against that, I'm going to part ways with that person more quickly than I would have in the past. Because it's at that point, it's not about, you haven't heard the opposing sides. It's that you have someone that is making a decision because they think they're at the top of the organization and they're not. When do you decide that this is somebody that you got to part ways with?
Yeah, I think there's a dynamic that we have to acknowledge that, is unavoidable, which is you can't part ways with doctors necessarily. I mean, of course you can, but you never want to get to that point. And that can be a major barrier. And so in those circumstances, what I rely on is the whole of the group has generally been very aligned. And so that's the strategy of, look, we're all headed this way. We invite you, we invite you to be with us. But if you don't want to be with us, that's okay, but you will end up alone. And then we just have to be okay with understanding, like, we can't bring that person along. There's certain things that, again, what do you tolerate, not tolerate, that we won't tolerate: safety, quality, risk, things of that nature. But generally speaking, those aren't the problems. And so we all just support each other and say, let's just keep moving forward because we can't let one person be an obstacle. On the administrative side, obviously, there's more discretion there. And Alison can maybe speak up for me here, but I believe I do a very good job of being very clear in setting expectations, not just directionally, strategically for the company, but just culturally, right? Like, there are things that we can do as a team, and there are things that we cannot do that I will not allow because they do not represent the team that we're trying to build here. And everybody gets to have a choice, right? Like, again, you can come with us, or you'll be left behind. And if being left behind makes you very disruptive to what we're trying to accomplish, then we will have a conversation about what it looks like to be successful here. And I tend to try to handle those in a way that says, listen, this is what success looks like. It's your choice to show up and represent that, because if you can't be successful here. And I've had that conversation in the organization, and it means one of two things, which is you can decide that this isn't for you and that someplace else is a better fit, which is okay. Listen, there's no judgment, right? Everybody has, a fit for themselves. And this is not the fit for everybody. This is a super engaged team. Like, we're all in it together. And, that's not for everybody. Or alternatively, right? Like, if you can't come along, I owe it to the team. Actually, I owe the organization the best team. And I have a strategy, or it's not a strategy. It's just my way. I will fully invest in you as a leader. You get everything from me. You get one-on-one time. You get, like, call me when you need to bump something off of me. You will get it. And I will heavily invest in you. But if you can't come along and overcome the challenges that are natural to trying to, step up into leadership, then there will come a time when I actually owe the team the decision. And I have to shift my thinking and my perspective from, okay, what do I owe this individual in terms of supporting their leadership growth versus what do I owe the team in terms of the leaders that are leading them? And, you never like to have to get to that point, but it is a reality. And if you're not ready to make those decisions, like, you're just not ready to be in an executive position. It means making tough decisions.
Allison, I want to talk about how that parlays to your team, and then how you help your team to make arguments that keep the other needs in the organization in focus. So as opposed to just thinking of this is beneficial because it impacts my lane, here are other areas. And not to pick on Ziltrix, but you gave that example of Ziltrix's customer service. Customer service is something where I could see a lot of executives, maybe even myself, if my team members were just like, oh, but they have great customer service, I'd be like, that's nice. These guys are 20% cheaper over here, or whatever it might be. Or these guys let us do annual terms as opposed to monthly, or vice versa, or some other business consideration that they would have to make it make sense from a business perspective. And customer service, I'm not just picking on Ziltrix. I do think there are organizations that have really, really good customer service out there that doesn't end up being as much of a competitive advantage as it should be. How do you make the business case for something like that? Why is that important?
Well, from a customer service specifically standpoint, I mean, the thing to keep in mind is that a lot of, Murphy's Law is that these things that will happen in the lab will happen on a Sunday at 7 o'clock at night or on Christmas Eve or something. So customer service does end up playing a really important role because oftentimes the person that's in the lab, either needs help or doesn't understand how to work or something's happening with the equipment. So they can't reach the lab director, so they call the manufacturer. Or even from you know, like for PGT, for example, like so many times we were like, I got to call the lab. I don't know. Like they didn't send me a box to ship the samples or they didn't send me a shipping label. And being able to like just pick up the phone and get in touch with someone ends up having a real material impact on the operations of the lab. I mean, I see your point. It can't be that like it's double the cost, but the customer service is a really important part because the embryologist, you know, it's not like they have somebody just sitting there answering the phone, filing paperwork. I mean, they're also in the middle of doing ICSI and performing important procedures. So they don't want to be stuck trying to get through to somebody. And they want somebody that they can just count on to help them. Yeah.
What is one thing that has really benefited you that the other person does or has done? I'll start with you. What's one thing that Cara does or has done that has been a big help to you?
Well, in case you hadn't picked up on this, the concept of leadership has been transformative. And I've been able to, I hope, really convey that to the people that I work with. But I started this position thinking like, yeah, I'm a really good leader. I'm a lab director. I know what I'm doing. I'm really good at ICSI and I can biopsy an embryo and therefore I am a good leader. But there's a book and a saying that the skills that got you into this position are not necessarily the skills that are going to make you successful. And I think what Cara has brought to me in my professional career is that she has driven home the importance of leadership and that it is something that we can teach and that you should be, or we all should be learning as we go and paying it forward to everyone else.
What about you, Cara? What's something that Allison does or has done for you that has been a big help?
Allison's biggest responsibility is to ensure that she keeps First Fertility out of the news. You know, we have an incredible group of, centers and professionals that are part of the organization. And of course, everybody believes that they're doing all the right things. And yet, Allison, is able to spend time, with those team members in those environments and immediately identify areas that people didn't even realize either were risks or were potential areas of affecting, their lab environments. And, who would even know that those, circumstances exist if you didn't have somebody who was responsible for that? And so I'm thankful every day. I mean, Allison got on a call with us the other day, one of our team meetings, and she was in her scrubs. And I was like, oh, where are you today? And she was like in the lab with the team. And so being able to have the visibility into those environments for the purpose of ensuring that we just understand kind of what do they look like? Are they aware, of different developments that have happened or different standards or different risks? Because who knows who they were trained by and, what did that look like for them? Now we're setting our own standard. And so, I'm very thankful every day that I have somebody who is at the helm for us in that regard. And it just comes back to that appointment of the chief scientific officer role, which is, if not that, then what? You're relying on everybody's different perspective of what quality, value, risk, et cetera means. But now with Allison here, you get to, formulate that perspective together, and establish it together and ensure that it's consistent and everybody then has an opportunity to learn from that. So she's also, again, just like very much present with her teams. She's not just sitting in an ivory tower somewhere. She's traveling, she's spending time, she's developing leaders the way that, I invest in developing, our leaders in the administrative world. And I just think it makes for a good environment and experience and commitment to purpose for everybody.
And now that I know that each of you are interesting enough to have your own podcast episodes, that's allowed now. We'll have each of you back on. You deserve your own shows because I could keep talking to each of you for a lot longer. Cara Reymann, Alison Bartolucci, thank you to both of you for coming on the Inside Reproductive Health podcast.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Go to data.insidereproductivehealth.com. That's where we're compiling so much data on new technology in IVF, products and services, market analyses, info and mergers and acquisitions, every data point that we can on the field writ large and the companies in the fertility field, we're compiling there. Go to data.insidereproductivehealth.com as we build that over time. And if your company isn't an IVF Heroes Universe sponsorship, your competitors are getting more visibility because we report on your category and we give that to your customers. We do that multiple times per year, and we do it around big events like ASRM and ESHRE. Go to data.insidereproductivehealth.com and submit your company today. Don't be left out.
Today's advertiser helped make the production and delivery of this episode possible for free to you. But the themes expressed by the guests do not necessarily reflect the views of Inside Reproductive Health, nor of the advertiser. The advertiser does not have editorial control over the content of this episode, and the guest's appearance is not an endorsement of the advertiser. Thank you for listening to Inside Reproductive Health.